Hello, it's Monday the 6th of July. I'm Rob Watson. This is a Decentered media vlog, and I'm out in the park here in Leicester. I've decided to get away from the house for a bit just to see, get a bit of fresh air, because we're in the second week of, I don't know, it's Groundhog Day, it's lockdown again, which means that we are not able to go to very many shops. There's no cafes open, and if I'm honest, the weather's been a bit rubbish over the last few weeks. It's not really been very summery. It'd be lovely if it was spring, but it's summer, so cardigans on is the description. But what I want to talk about today briefly is something I wrote this morning, and I wanted to share I've been writing these blogs recently which are about the process that I want and expect Decentered media to be following and promoting in the future, and just to give an idea of what the kind of process is that I think is productive and can be associated in a productive way with community media. And I want to draw a clear distinction between what is done through, if you like, strategic, transactional, behaviourist models of media engagement. Those things that see that there's a cause and effect and a set of actions and reactions when we post, share, inform people. And what I wanted to do is really talk about the different dimension, the multi-dimensionality that I think is important to associate with community media, and to think about it in a generative way, a creative way, and something which is grounded in human experience rather than looked at through systems or looked at through processes by themselves. So my thinking of this is kind of really informed in two ways. One is with the work of Herbert Blumer, who's a symbolic interactionist, and what Herbert Blumer wrote about and established was a process for thinking about his model used it right in the 1930s. He looked at the idea of industrialization and what it means for societies and communities to industrialize. And he says there's no fixed pattern. Often industrialization is held out as a kind of a neutral social process, that as a biased social process. And what he means by that is ideologically driven. It's in some people's interests. Well, Blumer's argument is that, yeah, in some circumstances it is, but in other circumstances it isn't. There are intended effects, there are unintended effects, there are negative ecological effects, and there are positive ecological effects. And what Blumer says is that we have to read the social landscape very carefully in order to be able to determine what form of industrialisation is actually being applied. And so resorting to simple simple headlines, if you like, or categories about what we think is going on is not sufficient, and that we need to get into the social situation, into the places where industrialisation is happening. And so he calls for a model which is very much based on an ethnographic approach. It comes out of the Herbert Mead anthropological approach, and in that case it's very humanistic. But what Blumer talks about is the way that we construct meaning socially. So unless you understand what the social engagement is, you don't understand what the meanings are. And what Blumer expressed is that meaning and the social environment in which meaning is shared, dispersed, created, are related. They are the same thing. They are interrelated. And it drew, when I first read this, I thought that is relativity, Einstein's theory of relativity, and the idea that space and time are in fact one and the same thing, and that if you change the geometric space in which people operate, and what happens when you have a mass, and significant mass, like a planet or a star or a black hole, things get sucked into that. It distorts the shape of space-time. and it draws things to them. And time, when it's closer to a centre of mass, runs differently than when it's more distant. And this is proven. If you go up to the top of a mountain, time runs slower for the people at the top of the mountain than at the bottom of the mountain. Aeroplanes have to adapt their time clocks to suit the differences. It might be very small. When you get further away from the planet, it becomes larger. So this has real effects, it has real impact, it has real distortions. Likewise, the faster something goes, then the faster, the lighter it becomes, the less mass it has. I'm not a physicist, so this is not you'd probably shoot holes in my explanation, but photons have no mass when they're travelling at the speed of light, and that's the constant E equals mc squared. So I was kind of drawn to this, and one of the things it led me into thinking about was the symbolic importance of communication. So I started to read in Carl Jung, because I was drawn to the kind of archetypal frameworks and the personality dispositions, and like the kind of things that we see with the Myers-Briggs temperaments, the 16 personalities things. But that got me drawn deeper into the work of Carl Jung, and he talks about the collective unconscious, and it's fascinating. He, in the 1930s, was having correspondence with Wolfgang Pauli, the physicist, the Nobel-winning physicist, about relativity, about indeterminacy. He was talking about the uncertainty principle, and Jung was interested in the idea of synchronicity. So, things happen, and then, hang on a minute, I was talking 5 minutes ago about a red car, and a red car goes past, and it's like, was that meant to happen? And we have this gap in our experience and our knowledge and our understanding, because these are things which have meaning for us, but they're unintended meanings, and we don't quite know how to grasp them. Things like, kind of UFO sightings, all that kind of stuff falls into this gap, this space. So Jung was interested in how we construct. He was a historian of symbols, and he was interested in how we construct meaning as individuals, but drawing on the roots and the precedents of in our collective consciousness. In other words, the archetypal patterns, roles, ideas that stretch way back into our prehistory, where where it's largely unconscious that we're drawing on these things. And the way Jung describes this is to say that you change one, you change the other. So we change the symbol environment, the symbolic framework, and we change the social relationships. If we change the social relationships, we change the symbolic framework. So for me, it's like, hang on a minute, there's this real correspondence between the two, and I thought it was unintentional. Actually, it is intentional. I've not discovered anything, I've not arrived at anything new. Jung and others have thought about this well in advance. But I've kind of coined this phrase, social meaning, which is written as one word, which if you change the meaning, you change the social framework. If you change the social framework, you change the meaning, and we see this a lot at the moment. In terms of an example of how this might actually work and be undertaken in practice, there's a lot of needs to be written about the UK government's communications response to the COVID pandemic at the moment. And it's been very narrow, and it's operated on a very functional, transactional way. A set of instructions: wash your hands, stand 2 meters apart, protect the NHS. These very simple, boiled down messages, which for many people, and here in Leicester it's been a particular problem, have not resonated with them on a symbolic level. And there was an interesting article in the Mail on Sunday, not a newspaper I normally associate with, but there was a comment in an article from, I'll put the link in the notes to the video, but there was an article from a community leader in Leicester who said he understands where this comes from in South Asian culture, because a lot of people in Leicester come from South Asian heritage, who have a fatalism Their faith, their religion, their cultural expectations are quite fatalistic. And the phrase he used is that their fate is written in the stars. And I thought, wow, that's a really interesting interconnection to understanding what and why people do or do not respond to messages. Because they're not resonating on that deeply symbolic level. We've stopped investing our communications with a kind of symbolic dimension. What we do is we boil it down to simple instructions and signs. And that was Jung's point about modern communication, modern society, is that we have stepped away, if you like, from the numinous, the sacred, the things that go beyond rational explanation and give us some idea of wonder. And oh yes, we look at the world around us and we can still wonder. It's still with us. And the things like, if you think our life is devoid of myth, just look at the number of superhero movies, the tales that we tell about, we call our carers heroes. It's kind of a misuse of the language, but people have to use things that they're familiar with if they're not using them in a conscious kind of way. So I've kind of intend to develop this and to look at the idea in more detail and start to flesh out some examples. The next stage, I think, is to look at archetypal patterns within community media, because there are some patterns of engagement, patterns of behaviour, types of personalities that recur more than others. And a phrase that Jung used was, where there's a role, there's an archetype. And so there are recurring roles within community media that keep coming to the fore. And I want to kind of understand what they're about and what they're for, and put that in a context of a symbolic understanding of what community media is about and what community media does and what its purpose is, why it is meaningful for people, not just why it functions as a set of transactions or a set of characteristics, but what is the meaning, what are the meanings that people hold in this regard. If I can kind of put that together, then I'll be making some progress onto the next step. So, as ever, any thoughts, any interjections, any ideas, it'd be great to extend this into conversations on the podcast or to do other blogs, vlogs, whatever. Give us a just message me. It's Decentered Media at Decentered Media. Either on Twitter or Instagram. You can email me at robwatson@decentered.co.uk. The website is decentered.co.uk. We're on Patreon if you want to leave a donation. Some coffee is always welcome. But until next time, keep safe, wear your mask, be socially distant. It's important. This virus is not going to go away by itself, despite what some I was going to swear then, but despite what President Trump says, this is not over by a long chalk. So please follow the social distancing guidelines. Push past the reticence that we have to wear masks. I'll be putting mine back on in a second. It's interesting, isn't it? This has become a symbol. Which pocket have I got it in? It's become a symbol of our times. This surgical mask has become something which is dividing people, and it's either induced a sense of fear in a population. The take-up of wearing the mask is really low in the UK, but elsewhere it's really high, so it has symbolic importance. And we won't get people to wear masks until we understand and can express what that symbolic importance is. So a lot to be thinking about in future episodes of this vlog. So speak to you soon.